Night in the Woods, originally released in February of 2017 by indie developer Infinite Fall, is probably most appropriately comparable to a coming-of-age story. Presented through a deceptively cartoonish zoomorphic style, the game hinges on the story of May Borowski, a 20-year-old college dropout who returns home to Possum Springs. In true adventure game fashion, the majority of Night in the Woods revolves around the narrative, with much of what little gameplay there is being pushed aside in favour of an extremely character-driven experience. And if you've heard anything about Night in the Woods, this information probably doesn't surprise you. The game is well known for presenting an excellent example of dialogue and story, establishing its characters as well-rounded, continuously evolving individuals, as opposed to the lifeless NPCs that would simply exist purely to drive the plot forward. Without giving too much away before spoilers, it's May's interactions with these characters that effectively makes up for around 90% of the game, and ultimately what keeps you interested in seeing where things go. Truthfully, there's little point in even adhering to my usual spoiler-free zone this time around. I mean it when I say that similar to my Misao review, the story is the entire focus of Night in the Woods, and every beat of it is spoiler material. That being said, I will at least offer a very brief summary of the game's premise, in case it strikes you as something worth playing blind. And I'm aware that this might sound odd. I usually recommend every game I cover to be played blind, and sure, Night in the Woods is no exception. But I would be lying if I didn't admit that I struggled at times with the game, and this will be something that we get into later. So before we talk spoilers, let's cover the basics. Returning to Possum Springs, May surprises her parents with the information that she will be back home not just to visit, but for good. And the reason for her quitting college isn't offered, with instead the age-old "we'll talk about it later" being thrown up as a diversion. Having currently no job, educational responsibilities, or any real obligations, May finds herself wandering Possum Springs with a certain lack of purpose, and the townsfolk aren't always pleased to see her again. When speaking to members of the town, May is often met with comments that indicate she was never the most desired individual around, and when re-exploring the town, it's quickly apparent to May that much has changed in the time she's been away, with a multitude of local businesses closing in the wake of more corporate organisations taking root. Her old school friends Gregg and Angus have also changed, an element to Night in the Woods that will become more important to the narrative as the story progresses. As previously mentioned, at its heart, the game presents something of a coming-of-age story through the eyes of May Borowski, but there is a lot more going on underneath the surface that might not be apparent at first. In fact, the more you delve into Night in the Woods, the more you come to realise that, despite some truly grounded character interactions and dialogue, May's journey is told through something of a hyper-realistic lens. Characters will sometimes respond to situations in a wholly unnatural manner, or their personality traits might seem exaggerated to the point of ridiculousness, or even being dislikable. Now, considering the game's colourful zoomorphic style, it might not seem surprising at first that the characters behave in an exaggerative manner, but for the most part, in spite of the art direction, the overarching story is told straight. And I mean black and white straight. Night in the Woods is not a happy game, nor does it tend to focus much on optimistic positives. Instead, May's tale is one that starts poorly and seems to only be worsening as time goes on. And that's where I'm leaving it before the real spoilers kick in. As noted before, I may have some personal reservations about certain elements of the game, which we will touch on later. But regardless, if you love story-focused narratives, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you to play this game first, before I completely open the can of worms that is this game's story. So if you're new to Night of the Woods, I recommend you come back after playing it. If you're sticking around, you're in it for the long run. Before moving forward, it's worth noting that Night in the Woods is once again a title I'm covering with multiple endings, and as a result is also one that allows for a certain amount of player choice. It's certainly not akin to anything you might expect from an Until Dawn Telltale-esque release, with the level of player influence on the storyline being kept fairly minimum. But if you're perhaps familiar with the game and things start to look a little different as the review progresses, this is why. When first beginning the game, you're met with a Firewatch-style dialogue that allows for a few historical details to be selected, and it's a nice touch. It immediately offers some early intrigue as to how these details might come up later, and despite some very clear red flags, I can genuinely say that I was still a little caught off guard by May's grandfather just declaring that the house is haunted, and this was after they ate the young. You'd think after Misao I'd have learned to pay more attention to the spooky spook, but the prologue finishes and you take control of the newly arrived May Borowski, who has just stepped off the bus to a deserted station at night, her only company now being a particularly sardonic bird-looking janitor and May's equally sarcastic observations of your surroundings. And honestly, as soon as I was introduced to May, I immediately fell in love with her endless avalanche of dry humour. There are some extremely recognisable Chloe-like traits in May, which, speaking as someone with a massive appreciation of Life is Strange, was always going to be a winning personality trait for me. She seemed to have an amusing comment for almost everything around her, and I was laughing a lot in the earlier stages of the game, especially after May mocks the janitor's request for a free soda, declaring it to be a waste, in spite of needing it to appease him in order to exit through the station door that the janitor claims has literally just been broken, but then he repairs it seconds later. This is the first indication of that hyper-realism I'd mentioned before, instead of adhering to the typical adventure game process of, go here, do this thing, come back, oh wait, I need something else. Night in the Woods instead opens with snappy dialogue and an even snappier resolution to a problem that might not have been a problem at all. And without any further explanation, the janitor wishes May farewell and leaves, even shutting the lights off on his way out and leaving her in the dark. What a nice man. Following this relatively strange opening chapter, May steps outside to find that her luck has continued to remain on a bit of a downer. Her parents, who she expected to be picking her up from the bus station, are nowhere to be seen, and neither is the janitor, who has completely disappeared. If I'm honest, as soon as May commented on hiking through the woods in the dark, it was at this point that I almost rolled my entire face into the back of my head and went, oh right, Night in the Woods, yeah, I get it. Because I hadn't actually looked into Night in the Woods at all before playing it. I'd received the game as part of itch.io's incredibly generous racial diversity bundle, and after downloading a few dozen titles, I opened the game completely at random. Of course, this isn't massively important to the review, I was just happy to discover that this was by no means the definitive moment of the game. There is so much more to come. If anything, it's actually a fairly innocuous moment, although it does allow for some always welcome atmosphere. Seriously, the design for this place is fucking delicious. So May makes her way through the woods in what is almost an uneventful experience. She comes across an old children's climbing frame, and after discovering that the exit is blocked, decides to climb the tree. And then the electrical line. Yet despite the zoomorphic style appearing to simply be an artistic representation of the characters, turns out May is still very much the cat she is depicted to be, except when it comes to landing on her feet. After trading some pleasant conversation with the officer, who is later revealed to be May's aunt, she returns home to an unexpected father, who then apologetically explains that May's parents had confused her arrival date, which doesn't exactly go down well. With that, May declares that she's going to bed, and you are given the opportunity to explore the house a little, which is generally harmless and homey, but it offers more opportunity for you to get to know May as she continues to comment on objects around her. All in all, everything seems fine. May's mother is nowhere to be seen, but considering the lateness of the hour, is likely to be asleep. There's a creepy little crawl space that ultimately offers no actual importance to the story, and finally May goes to bed, in a room that feels extremely representative of her personality, including the classic indie character trait, the instrument.
Hi, can I help you with your cello?
No, it's my suitcase. I just don't think all suitcases should be rectangles, you know?
Is this a rhythm game? Wow, I suck at rhythm games. The next morning, May speaks to her mother, who, after her daughter having returned to Possum Springs with the news of abandoning her education, is understandably concerned. In response, May shrugs this off and leaves with the intention of finding her old friend Gregg and to explore the many changes that have occurred throughout the town. Okay, so this has been a fairly extensive section of the review so far, and it may either relieve or disappoint you to know that I won't be covering every moment of the game in the same manner. For one, we'd be here forever, but more importantly, there's just not enough actual game to go around. Sure, the whole rhythm game thing was a fun distraction, and the introduction has certainly been intriguing, but the majority of your time with Night in the Woods is going to be speaking to characters and running around as the story progresses, to the point that you're probably looking at 95% story and 5% game, and if I were to go through all of that 95%, you might as well be watching a Let's Play. But in spite of saying this, I think looking at the game's first few moments in fair detail is important. You're not only coming to terms with the game's style, which although is initially light and colourful, is clearly not going to be used to present a light and colourful story, you're also coming to terms with May. Or rather, the May that she presents herself to be. A quirky, snarky individual who seems unafraid to speak her mind or shrug off any criticism thrown her way, especially when delivered by those with authority. I say this because there's a lot of things wrong with May and she's trying her damnedest to keep a lid on all of them, but it isn't going to stay buried for very long, with small traces of it already popping up here and there. But before we get into that, let's talk about everybody else for a minute. So after wandering the town a little and familiarising yourself with the place, you first visit Gregg at the Snack Falcon, his current place of work. Gregg, depicted as an orange canine, be it either a fox or a dog, is explained to have been May's best friend prior to her departure, and immediately expresses joy at her return. I don't know what he's doing with his arms, but he just keeps doing it. I don't know what he's doing with them. I don't know, I don't understand. As is probably obvious by now, Gregg has something of an excitable personality. He's extremely expressive and enthusiastic, although he is also shown, especially later in the game, to have a hard time controlling his impulses when they occur. For one, his punk-like attire whilst working, and absolute zero concern for clocking out early to go to band practice, immediately implies Gregg's more rebellious nature, even leaving May stood in apparent surprise as he gleefully leaves the store, and May hasn't exactly been depicted as Mother Teresa. Contrasting Gregg's exuberant personality is Angus, depicted as a large bear in smart attire, who is also explained to be Gregg's boyfriend. In terms of personality, Angus is instead a far more reserved individual, initially almost seeming lackluster by comparison to his partner's self-expressive tendencies, but as the game progresses, Angus is shown to be an extremely caring individual, and in spite of originally being high school sweethearts, Gregg and Angus appear to be still very comfortable together, the game taking place with May, Gregg, Angus and Bea all in their early 20s. And speaking of Bea, depicted as a dark teal crocodile with an obvious penchant for goth attire, out of the game's 3 secondary characters, she's immediately the most interesting, even if initially she could be seen as perhaps the most mundane and grumpy. Initially being introduced in a somewhat mocking fashion towards May's musical ability, even in spite of her own ability being produced through the safety blanket of pre-programmed drum samples, Bea comes across as standoffish and less than thrilled to see May return, showing this either through snarky comments or the subtle storytelling of placing May and Bea on opposite ends of the table when the 4 of them go out for pizza together. As the two continue to interact, it becomes apparent that Bea looks down on May and considers her to be immature, snorting and telling her that life happens when May asks as to whether or not the band gets together to play shows. And to be honest, she's right. May is immature. Compared to Gregg, Angus and Bea, who are all working jobs and paying for bills or rent, the only real responsibility that May has to deal with is the one that she has literally just run away from, an expensive college tuition. As a result, it's obvious that her interest in rejoining the band is more through a need to just feel useful or have a small measure of purpose, when in actuality all she would be really doing is riding the rather short coattails of her working class ex-schoolmates who simply get together once in a while to let off some steam and forget the dull reality of adulthood. Sure, Gregg is prone to some less than wise impulses, but this is where Angus comes in. He acts as something of a sensible bedrock for Gregg to anchor him and keep him from the more immature decisions. However, as soon as May makes an appearance, Gregg immediately throws caution to the wind in a burst of excitement, evidently knowing from previous experience that May would just go along with it without any complaint, which is exactly what she does. As for Bea, she's clearly the most mature member of the group, even if this is a character trait that she begrudgingly takes on, which automatically induces an awkward dissonance between May and Bea, as the two regard each other from either side of a half-eaten pizza crust. In spite of this, the game doesn't dwell on it for too long, as the topic of conversation soon shifts to a missing member of the community, another ex-schoolmate by the name of Casey. Assumed to have simply skipped town by most of the group, Casey is described to have always desired a clean break from the town, having apparently previously mentioned his desire to leave. Satisfied that Casey has potentially found greener pastures, the group decides to head home, and the scene ends with May glad to be back home and able to see her friends again, and it's great. She's happy. Oh wait, no it's not, because there's an arm on the floor. which May then pokes with a stick. If this struck you as a jarring change of pace, then don't worry, Night in the Woods is only getting started. Naturally, May is advised to not poke the dismembered arm with a stick by Officer Mallcop, and thankfully B rescues May with an offer to drive her home so that she doesn't run her mouth off to the point of getting arrested. So B drives May home, and as expected, the drive is an awkward affair. It doesn't matter though, because eventually it ends with B kicking May out prematurely after May mentions B's parents, leaving her stranded to walk the remainder of the journey home, which she manages without any real unpleasantries. At this point, the plot is probably looking pretty ambiguous, right? We've gone from lonely scene kid lacking purpose in life to a severed arm in less than 24 hours. So where the hell is Night in the Woods going? Why is a fucking arm just laying in the street for all to see? Why is May thrilled to see it and decides to poke the damn thing with a stick? Sure, this might be a hyper-realistic situation, but does this not all just seem a bit of a sharp right turn to you? Historically, Officer Mallcop informing the main characters that something bad is going on typically results in only a few different scenarios, most of which are bad, and I was kinda half expecting something like
previously on AMC's The Walking Dead.
Except the game doesn't go down that road. It doesn't result in anything menacing or apocalyptic the next day, it just carries on, to the point that the most exciting thing to occur the next morning is that May's laptop has a virus when she logs on, so she visits Angus, who happens to be good with computers, gets a fix for her computer troubles, and that's it. An entire 24 hours spent looking for a magic USB drive, when a severed arm has literally appeared out of nowhere. What the fuck? So to be honest, this is where some of those previously mentioned reservations were starting to creep into the back of my mind. Yeah, I liked May well enough in spite of her immaturities, but where am I, the player of this video game, actually taking her? Well, to be honest, the player has no real significant agency here. For all the good I'm doing running May back and forth over and over again throughout the town, I might as well be watching a movie. In spite of how well written the dialogue can be and the odd selection of answers that you're sometimes allowed to choose from, and the odd subplot that you can activate, there's already a very real distance growing between May and the player, simply due to how little that you actually contribute to the game. Oh great, I can electrocute May with a faulty elevator button, but it's only because the game told me to. Oh great, I can play bass guitar in a minigame. That's fun, but it's not really contributing to the overall gameplay itself. You're along for the ride, and for all the good it does in leading May forward, it's about as effective as strapping an elastic band to a controller and grabbing popcorn. Now, I'm not saying that all games have to be neck deep in gameplay loops and hyper-interactive mechanics, I'm not saying that at all. Some of my most beloved games are extremely story-focused and either offer little in terms of substantial gameplay, or offer such an extremely compelling narrative that the gameplay itself almost feels unnecessary. And while I am currently detailing an issue with the game that I think detracts from the experience, or at the very least the game's pacing, I also must now contradict myself in stating that it was this very same issue that ultimately won me over. And that sounds stupid, right? How can a problem as specific as this also end up being a positive? Well, it's actually pretty simple. In spite of my sympathy and overall appreciation of May's characterization in the opening moments of the game, that didn't last long. In fact, I came very, very close to hating her. So on the same day as repairing the laptop, May is indirectly invited to a party in the woods by Gregg, who assumes that she had already been invited when in actuality she had no idea. Taking it in her stride, May enthusiastically agrees to go, but is clearly nervous and suffering bouts of extremely low self-esteem, internally arguing with herself when literally faced with her own reflection, and even hinting towards her own sexual insecurities, a factor that is further exacerbated when she is informed that an ex-boyfriend will be attending the party. Now, touching on May's sexuality for a brief moment, when taken into consideration alongside Gregg and Angus, this is an element to Night in the Woods story that I think the game actually handles really well. There have been far too many instances of homosexuality or bisexuality in past media just being thrown in as either a substitute for taking the necessary time to really fully establish characterization, or otherwise just simply mishandling what could have been an interesting character trait. I'm hardly the most educated person around in the world of discussing alternative forms of sexuality, but I do think that the way Night in the Woods handles Gregg and Angus in particular really deserves some recognition, purely just due to how believable their relationship seems. It's not over the top or campy or even focused on all that much. It just works. They're together, they work well together, they're happy together, and that's all that matters. As for May, she's a different story. There's a short scene prior to meeting Angus and repairing the laptop that sees May speaking with a cashier. It's a conversation that is initially required to locating Angus as he's no longer at work. However, you are then offered the opportunity to continue speaking to her, and if you do, she will detail that she mostly works night shifts and spends most of her days babysitting and meeting cute guys, to which May comments this. When asked what her issue is, May then shrugs off the comment with the following statement that cute guys are overrated, thus ending the optional conversation with no further dialogue available. Now this could just be an innocuous preferential thing, right? Not every girl is going to go for cute guys. Everyone has different tastes and whatnot, but with May, it's a lot deeper than that. Through hints and actions later in the game, it's clear that she's still struggling to deal with her sexuality, not really even coming close to identifying how she feels. And to bring this whole tangent full circle, the first major example of this, and what could be considered something of a turning point for the game, is the party in the woods. So by now, if the player even gives a shred of a damn towards May, they're probably going to want the party to go well. She's feeling hard done by, down on her luck and her self-esteem, and this is probably a sentiment that most players can relate to when considering the disgusting mess that most high school or college experiences can be. And yet, unsurprisingly, when opening the scene, May states that she is immediately unhappy with her surroundings. And it's not hard to see why. Chatting with a friend is B, who keeps to herself and shows little interest in socializing with May, whereas on the other side of the party are Gregg and Angus, who show concern for May but hardly take any action in stopping her as she proceeds to wallow in self-pity and take drink after drink after drink. Also attending the party is Cole, the previously mentioned ex-flame of a relationship that is heavily implied to have ended poorly, to the point that May even penned a furiously bitter breakup song by the name of Go Get Dead Angel Face. And so, while trying to muster the courage to speak to Cole, May continues to drink, becoming more obnoxious and allowing her volatile impulses free rein until finally her friends sternly advise her to stop drinking and sit by the fire. Now it's during these outbursts that May lets loose some of her insecurities, ranging from apathy towards adult responsibilities, the sad admission that she feels that nobody really likes her, the irritable fact of not yet having a driving license, and the miserable memory that her father's drinking addiction had once rendered him a danger to May's mother. And of course there's Cole, to which all May really wants to do is talk to, but when she does, in spite of Cole acting perfectly pleasant and seemingly happy to see her, it goes horribly wrong. Unable to control her nerves, May stumbles her way through some previously prepared social anecdotes, and as she does, Cole becomes all the more confused. Eventually, May snaps a little, clearly furious with her own inability to simply maintain a conversation, and finally asks Cole what the hell his problem is, spoiling the conversation even more. In spite of this, as May sits by the fire, deflated and alone, Cole then approaches her, seemingly happy again to see her, and attempts to make conversation. But by this point, May is drunk. She rants about the cashier's inclination towards cute boys and about how Cole is a cute boy, and that she hates them. Standing up and drawing the attention of everybody around, May explodes into a tirade of self-pity, jealously ripping into far more socially capable college students, whilst declaring that it's not her fault that she is who she has become. Drunkenly, she yells about possessing what she refers to as nightmare eyes, and even goes so far as to threaten to stab those that might see her looking through their window, before breaking down to miserably comment that all she sees are shapes, and that all she can do is sleep and cry alone. Finally, May throws up, and B takes her home. So coming out of the end of this scene, the player is probably going to be likely in one of two minds towards May, and the first is obvious: sympathy. You can appreciate May's point of view, even if it is a little bit of a pity party, and feeling lost and confused in your late teens to early adulthood is a pretty rough transitionary period that a lot of people do go through. Put simply, sometimes coming to terms with adulthood sucks, and May's decision to completely abandon her education is extremely indicative of her inability to cope with responsibility. I will say that there is a far more significant reason as to why she abandoned college, but there are still some key story beats to go through before we even come close to what happened. And as it turns out, the next story beat walks hand in hand with the other frame of mind towards May, this being frustration. Calling back to those reservations I keep bringing up, throughout this entire scene, I wanted to do something. I wanted to take control, to steer May in any direction that would at least lead to a 1% less self-destructive outcome. The game won't even allow you to influence how much she drinks, and to be frank, it's fucking infuriating. Why am I here? Why am I steering this character towards an end when the game clearly doesn't give a shit if I agree? So when the next scene plays out and B eventually reveals to May that her mother had in fact died, something that May, being so wrapped up in her own problems, had completely forgotten, you know what? I couldn't muster one single shred of sympathy towards May. I did not care. Okay, maybe I did. In spite of my frustrations and anger, I kept going. B takes May home and even tucks her into bed after May suffers an emotional episode in the car, bursting into tears after realizing how much of a jerk she's been. Once falling asleep, May suffers a destructive nightmare in which she smashes everything around her with a baseball bat. It's vivid, atmospheric, and honestly a really nice change of stylistic pace up to this point. Which brings us to the middle section of the game, and one that can be a point of varying degrees of appreciation, so I won't be getting into it too much. I've already commented on the fact that I'm not going to cover every damn moment of the entire game, and I still stand by that, no matter how closely I've looked at the first act, and the reason for this is simple. The middle section of the game is 100% story and dialogue, something that you'd be better off experiencing for yourself, because in all honesty, it doesn't really offer much in the way of impact on the end game, which admittedly was probably intentional. The season changes to autumn as May goes through each day with the choice to either spend time with B or Gregg, and depending on which you go for, you'll either be breaking stuff with Gregg or experiencing some genuinely heartwarming moments with B, amongst further flashes of infuriating frustration towards May. Truthfully, a lot of the game's middle section borders on slice-of-life storytelling, which by all means is pleasant, but hardly what I would refer to as a captivating narrative experience. The recurring nightmares are really what keeps things interesting here, or at the very least for me. There are some really beautiful uses of colour and contrast to elicit an unnatural cosmic horror vibe, and this is something that we will be coming back to. The wonderfully carnivalesque Tim Burton-y musical numbers act as both thrilling to listen to, whilst also offering more tension and suspense as the nightmares continue, even though these started to grow a little tiresome after the third or fourth occurrence, especially since a lot of the nightmares are simply going through the motions of repeating the same simple game mechanic of activating the 4 musicians. The real importance of the dreams is instead in relevance to May's mental health, which again we'll come back to towards the end of the game. I'll also say that throughout the middle section of the game, it is nice to see instances of May's growth, even if they're mostly achieved through what could be considered brute forcing her maturity, the most egregious of which being when May fails to understand B's motivation in supporting her grieving father by taking over the family business, instead interpreting B's efforts as selling herself out, when all she's really trying to do is keep the family intact after losing her mother. That one really rubbed me the wrong way. Before I move on from the middle section slice of life stuff, or perhaps in this case not so much, there's also one more point that I think is worth touching on, this being that May's mother seems to be finally getting sick of May's constant dodging as to why she left college. Up to this point, it was never 100% clear as to how May's tuition has been arranged, but it becomes starkly obvious from this conversation that it was an extremely serious financial matter, and one that May's parents had planned towards for effectively her entire life. As a result, there's an incredibly understandable sense of disappointment and even resentment hanging in the air, especially when May's reason for leaving is simply that she felt she wasn't where she should be, a sentiment that her mother repeats back to her in what is so clearly an act of self-control as she attempts to understand her daughter's actions, until finally May's mother tires of her immaturity and just states that May might as well have dumped all their efforts in a hole, and the two of them end their conversation in something of an argument. Now, it doesn't take long for May and her mother to reconcile, but it still felt worthwhile looking at the scene a little. You could argue that the resolution between May and her parents perhaps comes through a little bit sooner than expected, but it still has plenty of impact, and it's a moment that I didn't want to just overlook before getting to part 4. So finally, the middle act begins to come to a close with Night in the Woods' iteration of Halloween, the Possum Springs Ha-Fest. I'm saying it right, don't look at me like that. And this is where the game arguably begins to pick up the pace again. May is excited to don her spookiest outfit and proceeds to explore the town's festivities, your usual acts of tarot cards and comically soaking the townsfolk with water balloons. And in a really sweet act of selflessness, May also agrees to bail B out by helping her family business production of the Harvest Pageant, a dramatic performance of what essentially details the town's beginnings. So the performance is mostly a success, however May is surprised at the reappearance of the janitor from the very start of the game, who is implied to possess some larger knowledge of May's life. However, just as it had been in the beginning of the game, he soon wanders off to disappear again, before any answers can be offered. B thanks everyone for their help, and as Gregg and B announce that they have already made plans, May is left alone to make her own. It's a quiet moment, and in all honesty, one of the more subtle instances of depicting how much of an outcast May is. Wait, what the fuck was that? So, shock horror, remember the whole dismembered arm thing? Well, turns out it wasn't just a random bump in the road and is now back with a vengeance. Well, kind of. In fact, if I'm honest, it actually takes a little while to really get into the meat of what is going on. May chases the figure, but is then swiftly collected by Officer Mallcop, after which she then experiences a dream of a menacing looking well, and part 3 begins, titled The Longfall. So the first half of the third and final section of the game is pretty Scooby-Doo for a while. May explains to the gang that she had seen what she assumes to be a ghost kidnapping someone, and that she's also experiencing strange dreams. Surprisingly, in spite of some major skepticism, B, Gregg and Angus all agreed to go along with May's proposed investigation into what the hell is actually going on, with B in particular volunteering the idea that they search the library for any previous historical evidence of supernatural occurrences, which, albeit being fairly generic reportings of spooky spook, they do find. There's talk of a ghost miner by the name of Little Joe, and 3 locations that might be of relevance to the mystery: the local cemetery, the historical society, and Possum Jump, a nature reserve that Angus recalls having visited when he was in Scouts. So the Scooby Gang visit these locations, and in spite of the investigation itself never really amounting to anything substantial, aside from the odd glimpse of the figures here and there are instead moments here that actually offer some of Night in the Woods' most compelling character interactions. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these because, again, these are far better off experienced rather than me just simply describing them to you. There is also the matter that there are a lot of little choices the player can make here, far more than you might expect considering my previous irritation towards a lack of player agency. But for one of personal note, the graveyard visit is easily one of my favourite moments of the game. Once B and May arrive, May steps aside for a moment to allow B some privacy with her mother's grave, which she also explains to be a source of great concern currently, as a nearby sinkhole is threatening to swallow the graves in that area, simply due to how low in the ground the graves are compared to the more expensive plots on higher ground. In what initially seems to be an indication that they might be about to discover something ominous, May and B also do run into some particularly melodramatic teenagers who, although might not be anything special themselves, do end up offering more insight into May and B's past. Masquerading as keepers of a gate that leads into a deeper section of the cemetery, they demand that the two answer a series of questions, most of which are exactly the kind of questions you expect teenagers to think of. And to this, May outright admits that she's a virgin, again another indication of sexual insecurity. On the other hand, B confesses to have had sex at what can only be the most thrilling cap in the whole fucking universe, math camp! And to get to the point, she admits that it wasn't very good. The two then answer what their dream date might be, and while B's is fairly run-of-the-mill, May again indicates that her sexuality is extremely broad. She's ultimately not bothered by the gender, only that they have what she describes as a grrr personality, or rather a strong personality that can keep up with her own, describing that she'd like to wrestle with this person and then share secrets afterwards. It's a really nice little insight into May that I really loved. But unfortunately, the third and final question is the kicker. What is your most embarrassing experience? So B's answer is pretty hilarious with how shitty it is, pun kind of intended, but May's again is another opportunity to learn more about her. You're given the choice of which educational level the embarrassment occurred, and I think most players are more likely to pick the college option purely in an attempt to discover what caused May to leave. I know that was certainly my intention when I selected it. As it turns out, it's another example of May's sexuality, this time being a cute girl that caught her attention, before May then completely embarrassed herself in front of her after finally working up the courage to speak to her. Now, I'm not going to detail what happened because it's actually really heartbreaking how miserable it is, but I absolutely applaud how much care and attention went into the writing of this scene. It was a perfect opportunity to reveal some little details that are pretty damn important to May's characterization. And I don't even mean her sexuality, although I have focused on it a lot. Instead, I just love that in spite of how extroverted May attempts to be, she's in truth an extremely shy and reserved character. It allows you a lot of sympathy for May, in spite of how frustrating she can be. Which, by the way, is something that comes up immediately after. Once May and B make it through the gate, one of the game's most hyper-realistic moments occurs, and honestly one that I didn't really care for all that much. In a flash of frustration at having not discovered anything on the supernatural side of things, May decides to break Little Joe's headstone, and due to the sinkhole problem, they even manage to dig up and open his coffin before getting spooked by one of the supposed ghosts they've been looking for. This scene didn't do anything for me. It felt over the top to the point of ridiculousness, especially when taking place after one of the most insightful and subtle character dialogues up to this point. I'd much rather that they simply headed back to the car before maybe getting spooked towards the end instead. Breaking open a grave didn't do much in me getting to like May, it just felt unnecessary and really obnoxious. A few beats further into the story, there's another fairly important character interaction in the first half of this section that I'm gonna briefly touch on here, again taking place between May and B, and this one is anchored far more in exploring B as a character, whereas May pulls off one of her most dickish moments of the entire storyline, to the point that I honestly can't help but wonder how B doesn't smack her. So a little after the graveyard, May is given the opportunity to join B in something of a road trip. She's travelling to another town to a party that a friend has invited her to, and May kinda tags along. To first reiterate some of B's backstory, since her mother's death she has effectively been running the family business and finances all on her own, whilst her grieving father just generally spends most of his days in a pit of despair and disbelief. As expected, shouldering so much weight having barely hit her 20s has left a serious impact on B's personality, becoming far more jaded and cynical, yet it's obvious that travelling to another city to a party is a much needed form of escape, if only for a few hours, and even agreeing to bring May along for the ride. So with all this in mind, imagine how furious I was at May for completely spoiling it. In spite of B clearly desperate for a normal 21-year-old's evening, May embarrasses B by dragging up her past in front of a pair of complete strangers, two college guys that B had been enjoying speaking to. Unsurprisingly upset, B runs away, and in retaliation the friend who had invited her to the party rips into May for acting like an arsehole. Which she 100% was! She's such a dick! Okay, there are 2 points of view on how to perceive May, the first of which being that she is a flawed, genuinely believable character who shows growth and slowly blooms in maturity throughout the story, and there is definitely some weight to this argument. I know that saying this 2/3 into the review might seem a little premature, especially considering that there's still a fair bit of story to cover, but I think by now it's fairly agreeable that May is changing for the better as the game progresses, even if those changes are coming with the same resistance you might expect from pulling teeth. But the other point of view is that in all honesty, May can be so damn insufferable at times that empathizing with her is almost impossible, and this was another scene that really got me close to just quitting out. I'm glad I didn't, but it needs to be hammered home how fucking infuriating May can be. I hated her in this moment. I hated her bratty, selfish behaviour, and I wouldn't have been at all bothered if B drove home and just left her behind. In fact, I kind of expected it. But, as it turns out, B is an even better character than I gave her credit for. Not only does she forgive May, they drive home together as closer friends after B tells May that she thinks she's a good person, in spite of all of May's self-destructive behaviour, which is directed not only towards herself, but her friends as well. So again, there are other instances of character development throughout the first half of the third act that are nice to see, but to be honest, the focus on May and B's relationship is what stuck out the most, or at the very least to me. Perhaps it would be different to another player. As previously mentioned, the Scooby-Doo investigations into ghost occurrences are pretty lackluster, even if the gang do see the odd figure, but it still doesn't offer any explanation as to what they want or who they are, only that they're around and appropriately spooky. Now there is one nightmare during this sequence that is extremely important to the end of the game, but we're not going to look at that just yet until we've covered what's actually going on here. It may seem a little out of order, but ultimately I think the final moments of the video will flow far better if we save it for the end. For now, we're going to move on to the next significant story beat, which is the reveal of the cloaked figures, an act that occurs after May speaks to the gang about her fears of being stalked by the figures, who she believes are ghosts. She decides to head into the woods, feeling certain that she will find answers there, and the gang agree to go with her. They stumble upon a group of cloaked figures in what effectively constitutes as a cult gathering. Watching from afar, the gang witness a member of the group stuck under a boulder, the same member who is then revealed to have been careless enough to leave the dismembered arm in the street, an accident that the other figures intend to punish him for. To resolve his predicament of being trapped, the group break his leg, snapping the bone and causing him to scream in anguish, startling the gang enough to cause them to flee in panic, an act that alerts the cult to their presence. As the gang attempt to escape, May is somehow separated from the group. She puts up a good run, but as the screen darkens, a gunshot is heard. Luckily, May avoids the bullet, having out of pure chance fallen down a steep dirt bank. Managing to get herself back to the town, she wakes up in a hospital bed following a brief hallucination of her surroundings appearing to be a church. A scene that only lasts for a moment, but offers another instance of the mysterious janitor seemingly knowing more than he's letting on. There are also a few comments from various townsfolk regarding their opinion of May, which vary in attitude and are more likely to be a manifestation of May's insecurities rather than actual reality. The scene ends and May now awakens in her bed. So recapping from the previous few scenes, it was honestly a really welcome change of pace and an even more welcome moment of tension when finally meeting the cloaked figures, especially the bone breaking scene, which is presented in a really effective manner to unnerve the player. The shaking, throbbing text thing is hardly anything new to text-based gaming, but it's enough to make the player feel uncomfortable and even pity the cultist, even though you probably don't feel entirely sorry for him for leaving a fucking arm in the street. But never mind, let's move on. May returns to the gang physically exhausted and the four friends share a moment of normality in Gregg and Angus's flat. They eat pizza, play video games, and discuss anything normal that comes to mind. But May feels sick, and eventually everyone agrees to go to bed, with May and B sharing the sofa. Now throughout the second half of the game, it's been heavily implied that May's nightmares have been gradually chipping away at her mental health, one of the primary reasons that May's behaviour has been all over the place, and something that I've only vaguely touched on up to this point. And the reason being is that at last, after so long keeping it in, May now finally reveals to B what caused her to leave college. She finally lets someone in enough to know the truth, and it's presented in what could possibly be one of the game's finest scenes, calling back to one of May's very first declarations. Okay, there are two sides to May's story here, one of which being in regards to an incident that happened 6 years prior to the game's timeline, and another that is far more directly associated with her college experiences. The first is an example of May's ability to be extremely violent, severely beating a fellow student in front of an entire softball game, after experiencing what is referred to as a dissociative episode. This is why so many members of the community resent May, or treat her as if she's dirt or not worth their time. It happened in front of everybody, and the local doctor's only cure was to prescribe a journal, a method of which May can write down her thoughts and feel better? Sure. Eventually, May worked up the courage to go to college, something that was likely partially due to pressure from her parents, having been told on numerous occasions that she would be the first Borowski to go to college, an encouragement that was clearly meant with the best intentions, but it fell short in the face of her parents simply not recognizing the depth of May's mental health issues. And you know what? That's exactly what the player comes to recognize too. Describing her college experience, May details exactly what she meant by her declaration of having nightmare eyes. She suffers an implied depersonalization disorder. That is, that she sometimes sees objects and people around her as shapes and colors, startling her with their sudden appearance, and as a result, keeping her constantly feeling on edge, not knowing when the next episode may strike. And it fucking terrifies her. Although attending college initially started okay, with the episodes being kept to a minimum, the disorder eventually worsened to the point of May being unable to leave her college dorm, her appetite varying from non-existent to then suddenly feeling extremely hungry, and only being able to sleep properly after taking absurd amounts of cough medicine to knock her out. Finally, unable to take it anymore, May left college to return home, hoping that living with her parents and familiar ground would help in some way. Not exactly a calculated decision, but certainly a desperate one. Hearing all this, especially when combined with everything we've learned about May up to this point, from social anxiety to probable confusion regarding her sexuality to her nightmares, you fully come to terms with the colossal depth of the hole that May has found herself in, and it's really sad to see her walking in such an exhausted, defeated manner. Sure, she's also suffered physical injury, but it's blatantly obvious that May is on the verge of a complete breakdown. It's really only her determination to understand the mystery of the cloaked figures that is keeping her going. So she keeps going. When everyone is asleep, she wishes them all a love and leaves to find answers. And it's a beautiful end to a beautiful scene, wonderfully scripted, and one of the most defining scenes of the entire game. Except, you don't break up the Scooby Gang. May is followed by Bea, Gregg, and Angus as she approaches one of the cloaked figures, and in spite of any resistance she offers, they refuse to let her go alone. They chase the figure after wounding him with a crossbow bolt, appropriately responding in kind to the fact that the last time they saw the figures, they nearly shot May, and as they continue their pursuit, they are led to the entrance of an abandoned mine. This is where things get a little strange. They explore the mine in search of the figure, travelling deeper and deeper underground until finally they find the entire cult on the other side of a massive hole in the ground. Outnumbered and outgunned, as the wounded member is pretty keen to kill them all, May and the gang surrender the crossbow and the two groups face off. And the supposed leader of the group apologizes. The leader explains to the group that they mean them no harm, stating that the four of them are members of the community and as such they are under their protection. The cult merely wants the town to thrive, and to ensure that this happens they have a very, very particular solution. And now this is where we're going to finally talk about this nightmare. So out of all the dreams and nightmares that May has, this is the one that stands out the most. Occurring in the earliest stages of the third section of the game, this is the nightmare I mentioned previously that ends up being extremely important to the ending of the game. Instead of depicting the Tim Burton musicians having a jolly old time, May comes across this strange entity that only speaks in riddles and hints as to what it actually might be. It certainly isn't God, that much at least is made clear, but there isn't a whole lot else it offers to indicate otherwise. At best, it's the kind of entity you might expect to appear within the realms of cosmic horror, elusive and unknowable, and only giving out the smallest pieces of information to the tiny, insignificant May that stands before it. And as it turns out, the entity does have a warning to give, that May is swimming further and further out, towards things that are blind and terrible. and that once May meets them, she will never return to the Dreamland. So what the hell is this? Just a manifestation of May's mental health issues? Another extreme example of depersonalization disorder? Or is it just a really, really messed up dream? Well, no. None of those things actually. It's real. The cultists explain that back in 1992, a group of miners discovered the hole in the ground after digging deeper than anyone before, in the hopes of finding coal or at least something of value. Breaking through a wall, one of the miners then fell into the hole, and to the surprise of his colleagues, there was never the sound of a man hitting the bottom, never a scream of agony or surprise, nothing. After calling for him, however, something does answer back, to which the cultists offhandedly referred to as Black Goat. Now, most players and viewers probably have a pretty good idea of what Black Goat is in reference to. It's a fairly well-known allusion to demonology or Satanism to refer to a black goat, the most well-known likely being the Sabbatic goat Baphomet. Baphomet, of course, has also been frequently depicted in association with the pentagram, for example, the sigil of Baphomet, an occult sign that I'm sure needs no introduction. That being said, considering the whole cosmic horror angle that the game has taken up to this point, it is far more likely that this is instead a reference to H.P. Lovecraft's very own Shub-Niggurath, otherwise known as the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 Young. Now, Shub-Niggurath is not an unusual Lovecraftian entity to appear in popular media. She's the final boss of the original Quake, and even pops up in a South Park title. But where I think Shub-Niggurath's inclusion is most interesting for the concept of Night in the Woods is perhaps a comment allegedly made by Lovecraft himself. In a letter sent by H.P. Lovecraft to fellow correspondent Willis Conover, he is said to have stated that he envisioned Shub-Niggurath as an evil cloud-like entity, something that admittedly I have had a hard time finding concrete proof on. I can only assume that it is mentioned in the biography Lovecraft at Last, penned by Conover himself, but I haven't read it, nor do I own it, so I don't know. But to get to the point of this, doesn't the description of an evil cloud-like entity just seem extremely appropriate for a title so firmly rooted in the concepts of mental health? To those suffering with depression and anxiety and any other similar issues, alluding the horrible, inescapable effects of mental health to a malicious deity that hovers around you and just won't fucking go away? To me, personally, that sounds accurate. That's what I'm taking from this one. So the cultists explained that to further the town's prospects, either it being financially or even an implied supernatural effect, they have been periodically kidnapping those that they deem to have no apparent contribution to society, and feeding them to whatever lives in the hole below them. Naturally, the gang are horrified by this revelation, especially considering that one of the sacrificed happened to be Casey, the friend of Gregg's that had been mentioned as missing in one of the opening chapters of the game. The thing is, it's not just a matter of greed. It's outright stated by the leader of the cult that if the entity isn't fed, the town will be plagued by natural disasters until finally the damage is irreparable. Instead, the cult described feeding whatever lives in the hole as a necessary evil. The town and the entity coexist, and the cult now hope to impart the importance of feeding the entity onto the group. Out of options, and knowing that no matter how much they wish to avenge Casey, they're completely outnumbered, the gang leave, only to then be attacked by a member of the cult on the verge of escape. Most likely the more bloodthirsty member, but honestly, it's never explained. The tunnel collapses due to the attack, with the implication being that the cult members are now trapped or crushed. Either way, the gang moves on, and in a clear enough indication of metaphorically climbing out from a deep dark place, the group are then saved by one of the town locals, as they happen to be climbing the old well that is effectively in his garden, the same well that May had also briefly dreamed about previously. Safely getting back home, the gang do their best to return to normal life. May finally accepts that she needs to explain to her parents what caused her to leave college, and there's a nice little moment between Bea and May describing a shared road trip. The gang get together for one last band practice, and credits roll. A fairly abrupt ending considering what has just happened, but still a good one. After the credits pass, a final journal frame is shown, depicting May and Bea together, along with a memorial message to Casey. And the game ends. So the whole cosmic horror thing left me with a few mixed feelings. For one, I'm glad that the resolution to the Cloaked Figures subplot was interesting enough to keep me invested, especially when comparing the supernatural side of the story with the mental health issues. That honestly really worked well for me. On the flip side, I can see why this section of the game perhaps feels a little forced. True, there are plenty of hyper-realistic or surreal scenes throughout the game, but most of these are nightmares, and in that context, they're absolutely fine. Dreams and nightmares have been a breeding ground for subtext and symbolism in fiction for years. It may sound boring, but I can't help but wonder what the game might have been without the whole Lovecraft spooky kooky thing. And this again calls back to my early complaint of gameplay versus story, that Night in the Woods is a title that offers little gameplay because it is far more invested in the story and dialogue, and ultimately that's okay. It's a title determined to be a fantastic example of the story-driven genre, and it succeeds, albeit with a few bumps in the road, but it still succeeds all the same. I may have offered moments of frustration or even anger toward the game throughout the review, but I still maintain that if you love character-driven, story-focused games, perhaps in the vein of Life is Strange or Oxenfree, Night in the Woods is a must-have for you, without any shred of a doubt. So to finally end the review, I don't want to harp on too much on what has already been covered, but I do feel the need to offer my absolute appreciation for the developers of the game. For me, and I truly believe many others, Night in the Woods was a beautiful examination of what mental health can be, a turbulent, confusing experience that is often misunderstood or ignored, and as a result, is either reacted to with resentment or neglect. Yeah, there's not much here in terms of substantial gameplay, but after finally reaching the end and taking everything in, Night in the Woods is at its very best when it's simply telling you the story it wants to tell. It may not appease to those within the video games must-have gameplay market, but then that's what indie gaming is all about, right? Taking risks and experimentation. It's something that indie game is in a nutshell, and something I never ever want to go away. And sure, I'm no different. I've said things throughout the video that can easily be interpreted to indicate that I'm a member of that crowd, and sometimes maybe I am. But regardless of all of that, once the gang have accepted the bizarre reality of the cult and the weird Lovecrafty stuff, seeing them regroup for one last band practice is actually a really nice ending scene. In spite of all the oddities of recent weeks, they get together for one tiny moment of normality. The cult members are either dead or missing, and hey, Shub Nagurath might be murdering everyone in a few months, but in this moment, it doesn't matter. May states that they've earned it simply by being alive. Against all the odds, they're still here. And it's true. So, why not play a song? So, thank you so much for making it to the end if you did. I had no idea that randomly selecting this game was going to result in the longest video of the channel. I'm glad it did, but even so, thank you for getting this far, and if you liked it, please consider subscribing. It helps me out, and I really want to continue making these videos. I'd like to be around and continue doing this for some time. My theme seems to be either covering indie or horror gaming, so if you like either of those things, then stick around. There's also going to be some short stories here and there. In the meantime, I'm really glad this video is finished. I promise the next one will be shorter and will be released far sooner. Speaking of which, what even is the next one? I haven't even oh. Yeah, I lied. I'm not done with Night in the Woods yet. There's more.